Good.
So welcome to everyone. This is our seventh part of our 7-part series on Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor, on the 5th anniversary of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, Care for Our Common Home. Welcome to everyone. So I'm Jeffrey Burns. I'm the director of the Center for Catholic Thought and Culture. This event is sponsored by the Harp Center for Catholic Thought and Culture, the Office of Mission, and the Strategic Pathway, Care for Our Common Home Strategic Pathway, as well as the Department of Environmental Sciences and Oceanography. So welcome to everyone. All our previous episodes are available on our YouTube channel if you'd like to check those out. Tonight's presentation will also be available on our YouTube channel. Tonight, if you want the best viewing, put your view on speaker view. Well, welcome. We have another great panel for you tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Michel Boudria. Thank you very much, Michel. Take it away.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Well, we have had such a wonderful time these past few weeks talking about Laudato Si, starting with a framing of it through a climate change perspective by Dr. Ramanathan and walking through each of the chapters. And when we started this process, I knew who I wanted to close this event, and we were very lucky that we were able to get Dr. Mitch Thomashow to come in and do that for us. I have been working with Mitch for a while. I view him as one of my key mentors in the field of sustainability and working in the educational space. And there are many things we can say about Mitch in his introduction, but what I really want to focus on is the fact that he's been working in this field for a very long time. He was one of the first ones to establish environmental sciences. He's been a university president. He has helped establish the president's climate change commitments. But I think most importantly, what I've enjoyed working with him about is this sort of interdisciplinary perspective and why it's important to teach about the environment and to look at it from multiple perspectives, and hence why we're so lucky we have him closing it, our series. And tonight we've done it a little bit differently. So Dr. Thomashow will present, and then Dr. Leeva Chung, a colleague of ours and a longtime colleague of mine in communication studies, will be a primary respondent. She will ask Mitch a few questions that come out of his presentation, connect to what we're trying to do at USD, and then we will have the last 15 minutes or so dedicated to the general public Q&A as we have done, and Dr. Mark Peters will help coordinate those events this evening. So without further ado, I turn the floor over to my mentor and friend, Dr. Mitch Thomashow.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm going to do screen share. And we have the slides right now. There, perfect. Okay. Well, thanks for having me here. I've been to University of San Diego many times over the years. Michael Catanzaro brought me in. He saw me give a talk at a California sustainability conference. I've written a book called The Elements of I Might Be Helpful for USD, and that was a long time ago already. And over the years, I've visited the campus, at least a half dozen times, if not more, met many people, and feel like I've gotten to know the place reasonably well. And I love the University of San Diego. There's just great spirit and great energy. And of course, it's one of the most beautiful campuses I've ever seen. So it's good to be here, and I'm honored and delighted and thrilled that you've invited me. What I'm going to do today is I want to talk about my new book, To Know the World, because I think it really embodies a lot of what you've been thinking about. And I want to explain also why I think Laudato Si is such a great statement about how we think about the future of environmental learning. So I'm going to bring you through some of the main concepts in the book that I think are relevant for the purposes of this speaker series. And then I'm going to conclude with a few thoughts about how USD can take this further, because that's really what we want, after all, is for all of our universities to aspire to excellence in terms of how we think about environment and sustainability. So what is this here? Hang on a second. Okay. There we go. All right. I want to very quickly bring you through the arc of my career. I'm 71 years old now. I've been in this field for a long, long time. In 1969, when I was a college student at New York, there was no field of environmental studies. New York University didn't have a single environmental course. And if you study the human nature relationships, you really had to go to a traditional ecology program, scientific ecology, or a school of forestry. So my generation, many of us together built this field. And now we have a reasonably robust environmental studies field. So my whole career has been building environmental studies programs. I did it for 30 years at Antioch New England Graduate School. And then I did it as a university president at Unity College in Maine. The first book I wrote, Ecological Identity, I was fascinated by all the students I had and why they entered this field and how it changed they thought about life. So I was very interested in this notion of ecological identity. That is the different ways that people construe themselves as relating to the natural world, as manifested in personality, values, actions, politics, education, sense of self, and of course, spirituality. And then the next, how come? Oh, I see, I have to click, okay. The book I wrote after that is called Bringing the Biosphere Home. And I was very interested in how to perceive global environmental change. This came out in 2001. Ecological Identity was 1995. I think both books, by the way, are still pertinent. But I was also interested in some of the existential challenges of perceiving global environmental change. So I wrote a lot about the spiritual connections in that book, as well as issues of spatial and temporal scale, and both that understanding and perceiving a global environmental change is both an ecological and natural history challenge, as well as an existential and spiritual challenge at the same time. And then I wrote a book called The 9 Elements of a Sustainable Campus, which in part was based on my experience as the president of a small university in Maine, but also reflected a lot of the consulting I had done after writing the book. And this is really a book for campuses that want to focus on how they make their whole campus sustainable. And I know a lot of folks at USD have seen this and read it, and I've worked with a bunch of people around it. So that's the background for this book, To Know the World, which in many ways I see as my culminating statement about environmental learning. And I want to say that now that the field of environmental studies and sustainability has become established, it risks becoming staid. It risks becoming too traditional. And I think the great contribution of both fields has been when they're bold and innovative and dynamic and reflecting the incredible and extraordinary and rapid changes of the worlds that we live in. So this is an appeal that we need to move this field forward. And I have a lot of suggestions as to how we do it that I think are relevant not only for the readers of this book, but for the University of San Diego. There's nothing, I think, more spiritual, in my view, in my sense of awareness, than a picture of planet Earth from. I think this embodies beautifully the notion of a care for our common home. And if only we could get more people to take this scalar perspective. But I'm convinced, having read Laudato Si, and having spoken to so many of the people who have been influenced by it, that this is what brings us together. And I think care for our common home in and of itself is such a beautiful way of expressing notions of stewardship. And we have to remind ourselves that learning how to perceive global environmental change is the crucial educational challenge of our times. And the first point I want to make about Laudato Si is that it is, in fact, an ecological awareness document. I think that the Pope and the others who wrote this are very well aware of the following challenges. We're in the early stages of the 6th mega extinction. There have been 5 mega extinctions during the history of life on Earth. That's when over 60% of the world's species perished. We're in number 6 right now. That's accompanied by plunging declines in biodiversity, rapidly changing atmospheric and oceanic circulations, which is how I think about climate change. Because in fact, what we're looking at is a very complex, intricate, and magnificent series of cycles and loops and relationships that are changing very rapidly as well as the biogeochemical cycles and imbalances. So this all taken together is the planetary challenge. The planetary emergency is unquestionably a response to this challenge. So point number one is that it's an awareness document. We know too that environmental concerns are connected to many other pertinent issues: economic opportunity, social justice, healthcare, racism, violent conflict, and so on. But the connections between these issues and the ecological fate of the planet are not easily perceived. So what is the role of higher education in making those connections more clear? What is the role of the University of San Diego? What is the role of all of you in making those connections more clear? So the second point I want to make about Laudato Si is that it is in fact an environmental justice document as well. That is front and center. I am so pleased to see, by the way, that the Biden administration has appointed many advocates of environmental justice to key positions. That is just a remarkable thing. And then finally, this, by the way, some of the artwork that you see here is done by my son, who's a graffiti mural artist living in Hobart, Tasmania. Lord knows when we'll see him again. But I think this is a wonderful representation of humans reflecting back on the natural world. And I want to say that third, Laudato Si is a spiritual wonder document. So all those things are combined here. And all those things should be combined in how we think about the future of environmental learning and sustainability. So here's a little equation for you that represents Laudato Si. Ecological awareness plus environmental justice plus spiritual wonder plus gratitude and service equals care for our common home. And I hope as I go through this talk, you'll all think about the different ways that your own work and the work of the university moves this forward, what your assets are to take on this challenge. You're already a change maker service. You already have a strong tradition in Catholic social justice. You have the Kroc Center for Peace Studies. It's there for you. You have it. I think in some respects, I would say that the reciprocity demanded of you is that you take on this challenge in the most wholehearted way you possibly can. So now I'm going to take all of this and I want to talk a little bit about the future of environmental learning from my perspective. And I think you'll see the relationship between this equation and some of the things I've been thinking about and talking about in my book. I'm not going to go over the whole book, but I want to give you a sense of the full picture. Mostly I'm going to look at the middle chapters with some discussion also of perceptual reciprocity, because that's where some of the spiritual component comes in. But what I've tried to do in this book is I've tried to relate it back to the reader. So there's a lot of personal experiences. I talk a lot about memory early on and childhood experiences. There are a lot of activities and thought suggestions for people to take on, because I think any reader of this book has their own voice and has their own experience. And what I like to do as a writer and as an educator is to empower other people's experiences. I think that's really what makes us most happy and most fulfilled as educators. So I'm going to take you through some of this, but I'm going to start really with the chapter 3, which is the because this is where we are right now. And I think if you think United States and the globe for that matter, and you certainly think about where we are as a nation, all of these questions fit. And I like to think of them as conditions. And the first condition is the rapacious exploitation of the biosphere and its systems. How do we best communicate the necessity of ecosystem thinking? The second is the increasing disparity between rich and poor. How do we promote economic equity and social justice in cultures of materialism and entitlement? And by the way, I think that we look at these issues every single day of our lives. We confront them every single day if we're paying attention and if we're awake. Condition 3 is the apprehension concerning the integration and separation of global cultures. How do we promote intercultural understanding and cosmopolitan thinking in the midst of nationalist responses and ethnic chauvinism? And finally, 4, violence, weapons, terror compete with deliberation, diplomacy, and collaboration. How do we settle our differences through community democracy, compromise and service in the midst of conflict, extreme behavior, and fear? So to me, these are the heart of the these are the important questions. Often they're described as diversity, equity, and inclusion. And equity is condition 2, diversity is condition 3, inclusion is condition 4. but I want to bring them all together this way and link them back to how we think about the exploitation of the biosphere and the necessity of ecosystem thinking. Now, for many years, environmental studies, for the most part, focused exclusively on condition one. But now it can't. If the environmental field is to really flourish and to make a difference, it has to link all of these things together. And the same goes for condition 2, 3, and 4. If you're looking at issues of equity, issues of race, issues of inclusion, you can't ignore the question of environment. So all of these things need to be addressed. And unless we provide our students with the capacity to address them, we are not doing them a service. Here are some additional trends that impact the future of environmental learning, and for that matter, all of higher education. We are increasingly living on an urban planet. By 2050, 80% of the global population will be living in cities. We are increasingly a cosmopolitan culture. A lot of the response that we've seen in the last decade or so, culminating with the last regime here, what I described as the years of the hideous corruption, was a rejection of cosmopolitan culture. And we need to do everything we can to understand its richness, as well as its challenges. The demand for ecological equity and social justice is front and center now in the environmental field. New information networks and new cognitive orientations are changing the way we think about the world. We now live in a world where we have to somehow balance openness and vigilance. There's a lot to talk about there, but I won't go into it so much, other than to say we constantly need to be open to diverse points of view. But we also have to be very careful because there is a lot of violence out there, and it's a very interesting border that we need to be looking at. And I think that all these issues and trends ought to be taught as well. So I want to say a little bit about this notion of the Anthropocene, because that's the word that's used to describe the times that we live in. In brief, the notion of the Anthropocene emerged from a geologist who thought that the significance of human impact on the environment was such that it was the equivalent of a geological era. And whether that's true or not, I don't know, but the notion of the Anthropocene is very helpful in that it calls attention to this challenge. But I see the Anthropocene as the following processes. Well, first of all, it's the acceleration of two mutually conducive trends. On the one hand, the global extraction of natural resources, and on the other hand, the intensity of electronic connectivity. And these two processes reinforce each other. I'll say more about electronic connectivity a little bit later. Second, it represents a dynamic perceptual reconditioning of human perceptual awareness. I mean, the fact is, what we're doing right now is we're all myopic on this screen. The amount of time we spend on screens. It really dramatically changes how we see the world. And I will again say a little bit more about that shortly. This chapter in the book gets into this in great detail, which I surely won't do now. The third is, how do we reclaim autonomy in a time of global transformation? I look a lot at all the claims on attention that we have to deal with on a regular basis. I mean, you can be searching the web and all kinds of ads all the time. Everything is demanding your attention. And I teach undergraduates, or for that matter, younger kids, to find a place, a center of autonomy in the midst of all those things that are claiming their. And then finally, we have the prospect during these times of a true human awakening. The possibilities are ripe if we handle this properly. So that's the Anthropocene. And I just want to tell a little story before I move on to, I think, which hopefully will emphasize some of the key points. On the bottom, on the upper left is my screen. On the bottom left is my room, my office, where I'm sitting right now, where I read. It's on the second floor of our house in the woods. We call it the tree house. And as I was writing this book, I was looking at the screen and I was surfing or writing or being distracted, because there are a million ways you can be distracted. And I realized that everything was being funneled in particular types of ways, and that my vision was becoming increasingly myopic. And then I looked away from the screen and I looked at all the books in this room, and every book is a portal of sorts, and every box that holds books is another portal. And then I looked on the walls and I saw all the pictures, and I looked out the window and I started thinking about portals and doors and frames and all the different ways that we frame our experience. And how the internet, for as wonderful it's allowed me to write this book, it's allowed us to have this conversation, but it does channel us in a very specific direction. And we need to teach awareness about that. And then I went outside and suddenly everything opened up. My senses opened up and I saw the big picture and I saw the whole world. And it was a balancing that's so desperately needed. So a lot of what I write about in this book is balance. And how do you balance? And what's the fundamental challenge for educators in providing that balance? So what I come up with in this chapter and throughout the book is what I call the deliberate pause. And that is ways that you can take a few seconds or a few minutes or maybe more time than that, so that you can just center yourself in using the best mindfulness traditions or spiritual traditions that you're accustomed to really see yourself in place and see yourself on the planet and to open up your senses to the external world. It is really hard to do, but it must be done for all kinds of obvious reasons. And I think that's a spiritual challenge as well as an educational challenge. And I think that that's a very important part of Laudato Si, is not taking this for granted. And care for our common home means appreciation, it means gratitude, and it means above all paying attention. I'd like to get now into some of the substantive issues in the book and what I also think ought to be on the front lines of how we think about environmental learning and sustainability. And I'm going to focus now on two interrelated themes. One is networks and connectivity, and the second is migration. Which I think is the seminal environmental issue of our time and the next several decades. This is a photograph of the Transcontinental Railroad of the Golden Spike. It's in Promontory, Utah. And on a cross-country trip between Seattle and New Hampshire, my wife and I were driving, and I really wanted to go here because to me this represented the first national connectivity of the United States. And once we had that connectivity, the flow of goods, the flow of ideas, the flow of things east and west became enormous. And in many respects, the conceptualization of a transcontinental railroad lends itself to the conceptualization of the internet and the connectivity that it represents. By the way, the Transcontinental Railroad was filled with all kinds of corruption and shaky financing and corporate mega wealthy folks who really took advantage of immigrant labor. It's a very interesting story. And it connects so much of American history. So what I do in this chapter is I try to juxtapose ecological networks with social networks, because our world is surrounded by networks. And I think the more we can open ourselves up to ecological networks, the better we're going to be able to understand social networks and also understand what connectivity means and how connectivity can be a way for us to really create a sense of security in our communities. Anyway, these are dendritic drainages on the left, and then trees on the mycelium on the bottom right. You know, if you walk into a forest, the connectivity that mycelium bring is just incredible. The amount of information, chemical information, biological information that's transferred between species in the forest as a result of the mycelial connective network. Paul Stamets, the great mushroom expert, describes mycelium as the original internet, and I think that's right. So this is all very interesting. And you know, as far as mycelium go, we have very few people, we know very little about mycelium because there are very few people who research it. Compare, for example, the number of, let's say, mycelium scientists, or for that matter, soil scientists, with the number, let's say, of bankers and lawyers. It's you can't even scale it. So this is such an interesting frontier for us to better understand the world that we live in. And the more you look, the more you see when it comes to networks. I'm just looking at ecological networks now. These are various bird migratory networks in the Pacific Ocean. These are some stylized diagrams of ecosystem networks and all the connections in a habitat. And you can see more of these. Notice the diagram on the right, by the way, which shows the relationship between different critters in an ecosystem, because there are going to be a couple of other diagrams that look exactly like this, but they're diagrams of completely different phenomena. So hold that in your mind, if you will. I should probably have made a slide where all three of those are taken together. And then we have to think about social networks as well. Now, what I think is that I have yet to come across, I mean, there are probably some, any education, any undergraduate curriculum where freshmen and sophomores are required to understand social networks. Yet, this is something that they're born into. I mean, my grandkids have access to social networks just by virtue of being in the world. But there's a lot to study and a lot to understand so that you can maximize your connectivity and make sure that you're not being co-opted or that you're not being exploited or preyed upon. So understanding social networks also means that you understand how to connect different people. We know, for example, that on Facebook, most networks are what we call homological. That is, people who have the similar points of view tend to congregate together, both in the visceral world and in the virtual world. But there are individuals who are nodes that connect networks, and organizations that have people who understand how to function as nodes, or organizations that understand how to function as nodes, tend to be more creative, more innovative, and more successful. So there's a lot of thinking that can go into this. And man, I can see an entire graduate program that looks at networks and how we think about them and how we learn from them and how organizations can flourish with a better understanding of networks. Just for fun, I put social network into Google Images and came up with this. This is so, you can think that all of these networks have different properties, by the way. There are networks that are robust. There are networks that are tangled in ways that are creative. And there are networks where you just, you cut one link and the entire thing falls apart. So a lot to learn here and a lot to think about. Networks are also connected to migration. And I think that migration is, as I said, I think it's the seminal challenge of our time. Right now, I don't know what the exact figure is. It's somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 12 people on this planet are migrants of one kind or another. And then if you count people who are forced to move within country, that what we describe as internal displacements, the number is even higher. So if you just think about internal displacements in the US over the last decade as a result of hurricanes, as a result of wildfires, as a result of the pandemic even, you have all kinds of displacements, and we really haven't accommodated it, let alone the border migration challenges between, let's say, the United States and Latin America or elsewhere in the world. So this is a huge question and a huge challenge. And I think, by the way, my view is the University of San Diego is really well positioned to deal with it and to educate about it. Migration is a part of the human condition, and it's also a part of what it means to be alive in the biosphere. Here's a stylized map of world migration since 1500. It's interesting to see all the flow into North and South America, by the way. And here is a map that shows human migration over the course of human existence. It's pretty incredible how quickly humans were able to settle the entire planet. I mean, just 12 or 15,000 people, a small band miraculously survived and made it out of Africa and then filled the entire planet. So you can't build walls. The movement of people and species is intrinsic to ecosystems. It's intrinsic to the biosphere. It's intrinsic to human culture. But nevertheless, we do. And here's a picture of all the walls around the world. And what function do they serve? And forget about it. The human catastrophe is part of it, and so is the ecological catastrophe of what happens when you separate habitats this way. And a few photos. The one on the upper left is the US Arizona-Mexico border. On the upper right, it's entry to Hungary. On the bottom right, it's Kuwait. On the bottom left is the Great Wall of China. So it's very important and interesting to think about this, because there's got to be a better way to move people between places, because the number of people who are going to be forced to move is only going to increase in the years to come. I'm not going to go over this diagram in depth. If anyone wants to write to me, by the way, I can tell you where you can get all of this material. But this looks at all the internal displacements that take place within a country, often for environmental reasons, but often for political reasons as well. Now, here's the second diagram. If you think back to that ecological network diagram, here's a diagram of the flow of people between 2005 and 2010 who are moving between different countries in the world. And it's amazing to me how similar they are. This is a very interesting diagram to study. Again, we won't get into it in depth right now, but you can see the incredible amount of flow of peoples between places. And the continents themselves move and migrate. There's some from 250 million years ago, when Gondwana first began to break up to what it looks like now. And this is, again, these are biosphere processes. Okay, and then you look at North America species migration during springtime. We're just about to get started on this. Well, maybe you've gotten started already in Southern California. We're just about getting started now. I heard a red-winged blackbird today. And these are the projected migrations on the left of flora as a result of climate change. And on the right, you see the migration of the monarch butterfly. So everything's moving all the time on this planet. And the more we teach that, the better we understand it, the more we're able to provide for it. I would say that a fundamental tenet of Laudato Si, I don't know that it's explicitly dealt with, but I'll bet it is you can learn a lot about a culture or about a community based on the way they treat newcomers. So, and this is whale migration. If you're interested in this, there's some great reading. I love The Next Great Migration by Sonia Shaw, which I highly recommend. Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns, looks at America's Great Migration of African Americans from south to north. And a year ago, National Geographic did a whole feature on this. Again, I do think this is the seminal challenge of our time for a variety of reasons. And we've already seen it over the last few years, and it's only going to get more intense. And we've got to open our hearts and open our minds and open our awareness to thinking about this. And I think it's the ideal way to apply all the ideas in Laudato Si. And tied to that is, how do we become a more cosmopolitan culture? North America was a cosmopolitan country long before Europeans arrived and colonized it. This is a wonderful map of indigenous language groups. And all these indigenous languages, of course, have their own vocabulary for describing natural processes and ecological processes. So not to romanticize it, but indigenous knowledge about the natural world was crucial to the adaptability and the survivability of many of these cultures. And a lot of that has been obliterated, not only in North America, but around the entire world. So in the book, and really through my career, I've talked about this notion of bioregionalism. How do we think about our place in relationship to other places? And how do we celebrate the diversity of places? And the important question to ask is, how do places connect to each other? How can you build solidarity and community in one place, yet at the same time be a citizen of a nation or the citizen of a globe? I'm not going to get into that right now, other than to say that cities are a place where bioregionalism can be practiced. It already is. There's a wonderful book called Ecological Urbanism that is filled with projects that are taking place in cities all over the world. Benjamin Barber, who recently passed, a brilliant political theorist, wrote a wonderful book called Mayor's World, where he basically says cities are going to be the principalities that can affect the most change. And you know this in San Diego. If you think about all the partnerships in San Diego, all the partnerships that you folks have with San Diego Gas and Electric, I think that's the name of the organization, and so many others. I know Michelle has done a tremendous amount of work building coalitions around the city and with cities all over the country. I'm not going to spend too much time on this other than to say that I believe that improvisation is a very important way to think about adaptation, and adaptation is a very important way to think about environmental change. So I place a lot of emphasis on how you teach improvisational learning and provide a lot of resources for doing that. Improvisation is a wonderful way to learn about improvisation is to study patterns in nature as another aspect of ecological awareness. These are all photographs I took. One is in Tasmania of running water on the bottom left, and on the bottom upper right is late December. We had some rain, and it was incredible to watch the flow of water. So I think studying patterns in nature and studying how they change and coming up with languages for how they change is a very important way to move forward with a lot of this material. And again, I go into this in great detail in the book. But I want to conclude with this idea of perceptual reciprocity, which is my take on how we think about spiritual wonder. And I've juxtaposed two quotations here for you to think about. One is from Pope Francis in Laudato Si, "Nothing in the world is indifferent to us." And then Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great Jewish rabbi and philosopher whose work has influenced me a great deal, whose line, "Indifference to the sublime wonder of living is the root cause of sin," was his basic response to the Holocaust. And if you look at the history of environmental thinking, it's filled with statements of wonder. Rachel Carson wrote a book called The Sense of Wonder. So the challenge for all of us as educators, and that's why I say Laudato Si is also a document about spiritual wonder, is how we teach for that. And I think one way of doing it is this notion of perceptual reciprocity. And what I mean by that is I think every creature, every life form, every landscape for that matter, on this planet perceives. And by that, I mean that it takes in its surroundings. It doesn't mean they're sentient, but they do perceive. And by tapping into that perceptual potential, we enhance our own. And if we're constantly just looking at screens or constantly just reflecting on our own thoughts and our own ideas, we're never going to get there. So that's why it's so important to use our imagination to enter the world and the lives of animals and landscapes, and to find ways of doing that through art and through reading and through study and through science, so that we could better understand this notion of perceptual reciprocity. And this is the other diagram that I wanted to juxtapose. I think one way we do that is through opening the synapses. This is the diagram that comes from from the wonderful book by Michael Pollan, How Do You Change Your Mind?, which is about psychedelics. And I'm not advocating the use of psychedelics, but one of the things I found interesting, and this diagram comes from the work of a neurobiologist who wrote an essay called The Entropic Mind. And the idea is that on the left is the normal, this is of course highly stylized, the normal synapses in the brain, and then under psilocybin, this is what happens. Well, I think this also happens in other circumstances as well. I think it happens with meditation. And amazingly with meditation, what happens is everything slows down to such an extent that you can take it all in. And so I think environmental studies does this too. When students go on a field trip, or it could be through improvisation or music or sports or play, when you enter a flow experience, those synapses all open. And when those synapses open, you learn, and you're in a state of wonder, and time it loses its meaning. And this is what I mean by perceptual reciprocity. I love the Taoist notion of absence and presence, and the idea of the 10,000 things are always flowing out of nothing. Nothing and emptiness become the 10,000 things, and then they become emptiness all over again. I want to conclude. I want to talk about the notion of perceptual reciprocity in your ecological neighborhood, and what I mean by that, and what it means for the University of San Diego. And then finally, a few thoughts from the University of San Diego. So I'm almost finished here. I wrote a book several years ago called Pacific Northwest Changemakers. My task was to profile sustainability organizations in the Pacific Northwest that were multicultural and multi-generational. And I could have profiled hundreds of them because they're all over the place. I chose 8, ranging from coastal Alaska to rural Montana, inner city Seattle, inner city Portland. And what I found was remarkable projects with people working together, making change in their neighborhoods. And you're not going to read about this in the papers, the Times or the Post or the Guardian. You're not going to see it on MSNBC or CNN or Lord knows Fox News, but this is going on. This is the great untold story of our time. If there are people in communities, not only all across this nation, but all over the globe, you can throw a rock in San Diego and you can find a community group that's doing something extraordinary. And you're working with many of them. So I think the challenge for all of our campuses and for all of us is to do everything we can to empower these groups and to facilitate learning between them and amongst them. So I profiled a bunch of interesting projects in the Pacific Northwest, Garden City Harvest on the upper left, which uses farming and gardens as a way of doing social work and dealing with food. Living Cully in Portland, which uses environmental restoration and environmental entrepreneurship to deal with a whole bunch of forest community in Portland. The Centerpole project, which is on the right at the Crow Nation in Montana, which is dealing with food sovereignty as well and indigenous knowledge. So these projects are crucial, and that's what I mean. And the book concludes by looking at this notion of perceptual reciprocity in your ecological neighborhood. Where do you find it? How do you find it? And what do you do when you find it? And it also concludes with the notion that just about anyone who's reading the book is probably involved in exactly those projects themselves. Now, what might this all mean? And please excuse any presumption on my part, because even though I visited your campus many times, and I did look at it, the last few days on the internet as well, just to get a sense of what you're up to again. Here are some things to think about. First, some ways of enhancing liberal arts education. One is to spend more time thinking about how to teach an understanding of networks in various settings. A second is the emphasis on sustainability and social justice. I think what's starting to happen now is a lot of sustainability coordinators at colleges and universities across the country are beginning to understand that sustainability for too long has ignored this question. And I was asked by the sustainability coordinators at MIT, Princeton, and Emory to consult with them because they wanted to do more than they've been doing. And it was really clear to me after working with them for a few sessions that really what they're interested in is dealing with social justice and issues of race. So I put them in touch with a person named Running Grass, who is the founder of a multicultural education center called 3 Circles. And he's done some extraordinary work with them. And what I see all 3 of those institutions are going to make a huge difference now, moving sustainability into the social justice arena. And I think you folks are just about there, and you can do this, especially with the change maker emphasis. And you've got really great folks. You've got Michelle, you've got Trey, and many others. Migration studies, you do some of it. You have some border studies going on. I think a really comprehensive approach to migration studies is so important, and I almost feel like we're not giving our students what they need and what they deserve if we don't cover this, because this is their world and it's going to become their world. Along with this is, do we really think enough about how we encounter difference? Is that taught as well as it ought to be? Is it covered as much as it should be? Really focusing on the place and community and the ecological neighborhood. And I know you do a lot of that, but we can always do more. And then finally, what is ecological spirituality? Not just spirituality. What is the relationship between Catholicism and ecological spirituality? And I know you have many thoughtful people on your campus who've considered this at great length. And all I can do is say, that's great. That's the right path. Stick with it, enhance it, empower it, invest in it. And then finally, graduate programs. A lot of this also comes from where my former university, someone who's consulted with many colleges and universities. And I think, well, what are programs that can really bring students in, that can really make a difference, that can raise money for an institution? And so here's some possibilities to think about. Migration, public health, and environmental security, especially in California. Migration is where public health and environmental issues converge. And you see it every single day. And we just don't have enough people who understand how to do this work the right way. We don't have enough people who are trained in an interdisciplinary fashion in it. And I think this should be a big growth area. And I think there should be some graduate programs. Migration and border studies as well. And there are all kinds of mixes. You can mix and match this in a variety of ways. Studying social and ecological networks and linking that to organizational behavior. or making that an important part of an MBA program. Sustainability and environmental justice, an MA in that or an MS in that would be huge. And finally, urban ecology and climate adaptation. And again, that's another area. You've got the expertise in all these areas. I mean, you've got the faculty to do this. And in every single case, everything I mentioned here must be combined with community outreach. Now, I think that doing all of these things is the mission of Care for Our Common Home. And I know that's been built into the strategic plan for University of San Diego. And I think that's, in many respects, this could be an application of the mission statement of both University of San Diego and Laudato Si. And that's it for now. Thank you for bearing with me as I covered probably way too much ground, but there's a lot to think about for all of us.
Thanks, Mitch. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Leeva now to ask you a couple of key questions. And we may just stay a little longer. So those of you who have to leave at 6:30 can, but we'll stay a little longer for some general Q&A. Now it's Leeva's turn.
Good, and I'm gonna just grab my tea over here. Well,
Okay, yeah, you grab the tea, have a nice sip, because that was so much. I just did a graduate program in 45 or 30 minutes. First of all, I wanted to say thank you, Mitch. A shout out to Mike Catanzaro, a shout out to your son. I was on your website, loved the artwork, and that was going to be actually one of my first questions is, who did your art? And you already answered it, your son. And so
yeah,
I encourage the participants to go check out Mitch's website. I'm trying to unpack and be a little more clear in some of the questions that I have, because literally I have 5 pieces of paper. But I loved in 1995, when you were first writing a lot of your work, you said you wanted to deepen awareness and cultivate the ecological imagination. Is that right?
that's ecological identity, although I use that term ecological imagination frequently as well.
Did you see or foresee in 1995 to now 2021, is there a common thread that you've seen in terms of the changes of our ecological imagination / identity? Is there something that you wished you would have added back then that we didn't, or that you didn't know?
No, but I don't think that way. It's a great question. I don't mean to demean the question at all. I think that one of the things I do in the book is I go through some childhood memories. I talk about a couple of the books I read as a 5-year-old, Harold and the Purple Crayon and The Golden Guide to the Stars, and The Little Engine That Could. I don't write about that book, but that became themes of my life. And I think what happens is that over the course of a lifetime, there are all these themes that you develop, but when you get older, you have a better way of articulating them. You have the experience to interpret them in ways. You have a voice, you cultivate a voice. So no, I think that, all of those books were a process of cultivating my own voice. But I never think that, oh, well, if I had only thought of that, we're all working on this together. And it's been all of us. I mean, the number of colleagues I've had in this field over time has been just wonderful. It really has. So, yeah.
Right. Well, I love that, because I just was talking to my students about Gen Z stress. And a study came out 2 years ago with the AP is that one of the biggest stressors for Gen Z is the environment, climate, and warming. And the mental fatigue and stress they have with this, with the cultivating of the ecological, say, identity, is what I believe is really closely related to your Anthropocene, which was to me more like a dialectical pull between our natural world and then our tie to electronics. I don't know if you kind of get my thought process here, but how would you inspire more hope to your great formula of ecological awareness, environmental justice, spiritual wonderment, gratitude, and service equals our care for the common home for students who are in the midst of this stress about not knowing what they can do?
Well, I think that there are many of them who do know what they can do, actually. And, 6 million who showed up during the climate marches. prior to COVID. This generation knows how to move forward, and their activism has to be supported, and we need to be in a position to mentor it. I think that, the last year has really taken its toll on everyone, but I think especially people under 30. Because they're at stages of their life where they need social interaction. They need to cultivate their social capital. The very point of the university, in my view, is to cultivate social capital. I mean, you can go to, I tell people all the time, what college should I go to? Well, they're all pretty good. They really are. They all have pretty good faculty. Which one is going to cultivate the social capital that is going to make a difference for you in your life? So I think that we've seen a bit, I feel too that when we finally get this under reasonable control, then it is going to be almost like a celebratory jubilee time. I mean, the pathology side of this is Miami and what happened there. But the other side of that is people are craving human contact. They so deeply desirous of it. And I think the same thing, that will be people who think are being prudent because they don't want to get sick and they don't want to spread the disease. But when the time comes when they can act together and move together and work together, I think we're going to see an explosion of action. I really do. And, maybe it's the hopeless naivety of a longtime educator, but I really see that coming. And I think this generation knows it. It really does.
Yeah, I agree to a certain extent because I teach a lot about values and some, especially with DEI, the diversity inclusion. It's really difficult to, with our values and like you said, after this is all over, once we're all vaccinated and everything is great, and we do crave face-to-face communication. My God, as a teacher and as a student as well. But some of our values are a little more non-negotiable, especially when you're talking about border and movement and newcomers. I loved your trans railway from San Francisco, so I know a lot about those stories. But how do you talk more about the openness and perceptual reciprocity to those when some values are non-negotiable? So let me give you a side note to this, because I loved your social networks, because your social networks reminds me a lot of a community campus, meaning that we're all doing good work within our little silo, and yet we don't necessarily communicate with others. We're like an ecosystem. Would you agree? And so with those intrinsic values that we have that are important to us, how are we supposed to spread our love and joy around when sometimes there is, as you know, a pyramid of what's more important and not?
Well, I think ultimately that's a strategic question. That's really a political question. And
well, bummer. I wasn't trying to be political.
Well, but I am, because, when you believe very strongly in something, and let's say that something is what I'm presenting here, that is my interpretation of Laudato Si, and you know how important it is for the survival of the planet to move in that direction, it becomes a political question, and there are strategic considerations. So I tell people all the time, you have to find a common ground when there's one to be found. But sometimes there is not one to be found. And it's a waste of time to try to find it. I think that's just plain common sense, and I believe that they're out there with whom you can find a common ground. Then there are people for whom it's impossible, but the ones for whom it's impossible get a lot of media attention because they have guns.
Well, yeah.
Right? So, but the great majority of people, before COVID, whenever I travel or anywhere I go, I love ambient conversations because there's so many ways you can connect with people but always I would ask them, here's another little story. When I was president of Unity College, the place was in rough shape when I arrived there. They had very little money. It was 2 catastrophic admission cycles away from the tank. And I had a board that half of the board members were really conservative, anti-tax, love guns, but like the wilderness folks, and the other half were environmental progressives. So I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. How am I going to do all of this? How can I make this a sustainable campus? Well, what I did is my first semester as president, every Friday I would visit another board member at their home. And I had a bunch of questions I would ask him or her related to their values, basically. I also wanted to see if they had any money, which they didn't. And after doing that, because I didn't tell them what I was thinking or tell them what I wanted, I just asked them questions so I could learn about what was important to them. And after that, and after I seemed like to them I was reasonably competent, they all trusted me. So I could talk about things like, how do we make this a sustainable campus? How do we begin to think about climate? And a couple of conservative board members say, hey, Mitch, do you really think that this climate is an issue? I'm not sure it is. And they'd listen to me because I spent so much time listening to them. Now, those are people with very different perspectives than me, but we were able to find a common ground and listen to each other. So I think it's absolutely possible. But every once in a while, you find the recalcitrant or the crazy or the person with whom there is no negotiation because that person doesn't really care about what you think. And that's why I describe the importance of understanding the balance between openness and vigilance. Because on the one hand, we need to be open to everyone. But on the other hand, there are people out there who really don't care about what you have to say and would just as soon eliminate you. So that's part of the reality of growing up in the world, is beginning to understand that. Communities of color understand that quite well. Jews understand that quite well. So, that's part of an educational process too. I don't know if that's where you were going, but that's where I took it.
You're going to take it where you take it. And I loved where you went with it. And, thank you, Mitch. I feel like I learned so much with your chapters, and this is a weird question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Which one was your favorite?
It's interesting writing a book. And I don't want to sound egotistical when I say this.
Don't say all. You cannot say all.
I don't typically go back and look at my work. But there are times when you have to, because you forget what's in it. And when I go back and look at it, I kind of want, how did I ever get my act together to do that? I don't even know somehow. You just put yourself in a zone when you do writing. And every chapter is its own puzzle. It's its own thought process that unfolds in ways. The thing about writing a book is when you write one, it takes you to places that you didn't even know you had in you. You come up with ideas that you didn't even recognize were part of your experience. So every single one of them led me there. But if I had a favorite one, it was Memory Forever Unfolding. It was a lot of fun for me to think about my childhood experiences and, to go back 65 years and to think about the things that happened to me and how influential they were as my life unfolded. And I also, in that chapter, distinguish between what I call adaptive wisdom and perennial wisdom. And that is, by perennial wisdom, I mean the wisdom of the ages. Laudato Si is interestingly, Laudato Si it finds the common ground between adaptive wisdom and perennial wisdom. Wouldn't it be great if all the world's wisdom traditions were so flexible?
Right. And I love that your book is really a culmination of the intersection of your philosophy as well, of theology, of Laudato Si, of your thinking, of your life. So thanks for that. So here's my fun question. I'm really intrigued by the improv classroom. And, we have educators here, including myself, who would probably like to pitch a class on this improv classroom. So a title of it, a marriage of it, like me and Dr. Boudria, teaching communication, EOS, like, what do you think? Anyway, give us an example of an improv classroom based on a pattern that of animal behavior or nature and wonderment or trees. What would be a great improv for us to think about?
Well, I think that if from the perspective of, and there's a section in the book that gets into this. There's a wonderful book. Well, there are two wonderful books that I'll cite. One is a book called Landmarks by Robert Macfarlane. And what Macfarlane did, he's a great writer. He was really concerned that the British Children's Dictionary substituted a bunch of tech words for natural history words one year. So he decided to find as many natural history words from ancient British languages as he could. So he collected all these words from Celtic and ancient Irish and Scottish and Gaelic, and he puts them into this phenomenal glossary. So there are all these words that describe phenomena in nature that we really don't quite have words for. And then I have a friend named David Lucas who wrote a book called Language Making Nature, where he suggests ways that you come up with your own words for what you see. So an activity would be to bring people outside, and it could be right there on campus, and to observe phenomena and to come up with a couple of words for which there are no words, describing phenomena that they've never quite seen before because they're looking more closely at them now. So that's one example. You can come up with zillions of things like that.
Shali. That was my word, sorry.
That's good. What does it mean? What does it reflect?
It reflects my learning from your talk and your engagement with us. Shali.
Thank you.
My questions are done, but I know that Mark Peters, Dr. Peters, has more to add to this conversation.
Well, thank you, Mitch, and thank you, Leeva, for that rich exchange. And Mitch, you've given us so much to think about, and you've already been so generous with your time and with your insights. If you want to stay on another 5 or 10 minutes, we wanted just to give the audience an opportunity to ask a question or two.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, I know the Knicks game is on, so.
Well, you know what? It's okay because I'm just going to watch it in the morning now.
Okay, nobody mentioned the Knicks score.
That's right.
Fine.
No one cares except me, so don't worry about it.
Well, Mitch, if I may, I'm just going to ask a quick question while people are collecting their thoughts and maybe typing their questions in. Just kind of a follow-up to what Leeva was asking. You know, this chapter that you were commenting on, you commented on the whole letter to the open letter to the world, which was beautiful. But this chapter in particular on education and spirituality. And so what we do in the university is slow work, right? You know that as a lifelong educator, as a president. And in my own area, the pursuit of spiritual maturity, it's a lifelong pursuit. So what counsel would you like to provide those of us who deeply desire to heed the Pope's call for urgent action, even as we recognize that ecological conversion, as he talks about it, can be slow work?
Yeah, it's a very, very challenging question. I don't think we can ever really fully assess the relationship between the pace of our work and its impact. So sometimes what might seem like slow work will have great impact. And sometimes what seems like quick action won't have lasting impact. Right? So how do you know what's ephemeral and how do you know what's enduring? And I think that one way to contemplate that is to ask that question of yourself and of your students when you're contemplating all of this. What's ephemeral and what's enduring, and what's the relationship between the two? Because there might be great value in an ephemeral circumstance. In Jewish tradition, there are all these rabbinical prayers for just about everything. And I'm sure that's true in all the great wisdom traditions, that there's a blessing for this, and there's a blessing for that. And that's pretty slow work, to take the time, but it may also have an enduring impact on your soul.
Thank you for those encouraging words, Mitch. I think the fact that the Pope juxtaposed education and spirituality, so the slow work of education and spiritual formation, I don't think that's an accident that he put them together. And I think there needs to be a conversion It's not just information, but formation that we're seeking. And I believe that that's what you're getting at when you talk about, when you quote Rabbi Heschel and sort of this idea that, to dismiss wonder is a grave sin, right? And this idea of trying to reconnect with nature and not get enmeshed in the busyness and the technological domination of the moment, if you will.
Yeah, some of the words I'd like to circle back to some of those words that you used: information, and then formation, and then a word that often comes after that is transformation. Mm-hmm. And we like to think as educators that we're involved in all three processes. Most education is didactic, so it's focused on information, and a lot of education is formation, that formation of character, formation of virtue, formation of identity. But the truly innovative and progressive institutions also link that to transformation. That is, how does character change as a result of our contact together, right? So when I worked at Antioch and Windland all those years, we had master's programs, and we'd have really interesting graduation ceremonies. And we would always remark to each other about the transformation that our students underwent in just 15 months. So all of those are part of it, and they're built into it. And it's always interesting to ask that question of the students themselves, at graduation, for example, where after you've known them for 4 years, in what ways do you feel like, well, how were you informed, and then how were you formed, and then how you were transformed? So thank you for providing the keys to that sequence.
Well, don't thank me. Thank Tom Groom at Boston College, who came up with the heads, heart, and hands. And every syllabus I have has some element. You mentioned community engagement and how prevalent that is at USD. And virtually every course I teach, I make sure that there's information, but there's formation. There's some affective development, some affective wisdom that's allowed in. And then the experiential dimension of connecting with the local community and finding some way, some outlet for that, some action for that. Yes. Mitch, if you have time, there is a question from the audience, and just because of my technological lack of proficiency, I'm going to ask the question for Alice, if that's okay.
Sure.
So Alice says, you spoke about empowering, I think that was the word you used, under the radar grassroots groups who are designing successes. What might that empowerment look like?
Well, I don't, it's different in every case. In some cases, it's just being heard represents empowerment. In other cases, it's a policy decision that is going to impact people in a really profound way. So it's a great question, but I think and I don't want to beg the answer, but I do think it's contextual.
Sorry, my wife got called into the hospital, and I'm babysitting here at the same time, Mitch. So,
oh no, that's okay. That's fine.
So we have an interloper. So one more question from the audience, and I want my colleagues here to have the last word and to be able to thank you themselves. So Ed wants to know, what do you see as the similarities and differences between the Green New Deal and Laudato Si? I don't know if he's testing your knowledge of the encyclical or your knowledge of the Green New Deal, or if he's trying to make a political equivalence here, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that too.
Well, it's going to be coming up and taking a couple of weeks. We could talk about this in more depth then, but my public response is, I think that they are parallel thought processes. The Green New Deal is an environmental justice portfolio for the nation, and Laudato Si is an environmental justice portfolio for the globe. And I think there's a mutual correspondence between both of them.
I think it's a beautiful and hopeful way to end our Q&A session. Jeff and Michelle, over to you, and Leeva, if you have any last words.
Well, I would like to thank Dr. Thomashow very much for a wonderful and challenging presentation. And I'd also like to thank Leeva for her excellent questions. You too, Mark. We're coming to the end of our series, and so I would like to take this opportunity to thank Mark and Michelle for putting this all together and being such wonderful partners in this endeavor. Thanks to all of you who participated through the 7 weeks. It's been a great series for us. I've learned a tremendous amount, and I thank you, and I hope we can translate this into some real action. We hope to continue this conversation next semester with a number of different programs. One, a spotlight on USD faculty doing good work in this field. Then we also hope to create a common home fellowship that will engage our faculty as well. So I'll turn it over to Michelle for the last word.
Well, clearly I want to thank our partners. This has been an exploration we started in the fall with Mark and Jeff and I think it has really brought out the example of how working together. I always say there's 3 messages from Laudato Si, and maybe I can close with those 3 messages. The one is climate change is real, it's happening now, and we can see the impacts. It's disproportionately affecting the disadvantaged people, and we must work together to come up with solutions, and that's what we've done. We've worked together, I think, to put the series. I think our panelists did some phenomenal work to connect to each other and to connect to the presentations. And I knew that we would close tonight with someone who puts connections at the centerpiece. Mitch, I think I've seen some more connecting diagrams tonight than I've ever seen, and I think it's ideal to talk about connections. But I also see the fact that it's about hope, and we have a chance for us to take what we've learned with this semester, continue the work we're doing, work with Mitch over time. And, Leeva, your improv question was ideal, because I think we're going to have to think outside the box to make this happen. And as I've said to my students before, they are the ones who are the engine that keeps us going as faculty. This generation is going to be the one that's going to help us move forward. And Mitch, I think the words you use that are key for me is that we need to be their mentors, but we don't need to be in their way. We just need to let them move forward and make this happen. So thank you so much for closing. Leeva, thank you for being able to respond on the fly. And to my colleagues, thank you so much. And to our audience, it's been wonderful talking with you. And we hope to talk to you at some point again next year.